Do you want to use GitHub but are overwhelmed by the sight of a terminal window? Well, you're not alone. It's incredibly daunting for beginners to have to memorize commands and decipher the buttonless interface. Fortunately, there is a little-known solution that can help you out here. It's called GitHub Desktop, and it's a much easier way to use GitHub. And today, we're going to show you everything you need to know in 5 easy steps. Right, so to start, you're going to want to go to github.com and sign up for a free account. Once you've registered and signed in, you'll be redirected to your GitHub dashboard. So we're on our dashboard, and what we want to do is create a new project on GitHub for our code. Now, a project on GitHub is called a repository or repo for short. So to do that, you're going to want to go to the top right and click this plus sign icon to create new repository. All right, so here we're going to enter some info about our repository. So first thing is the name, and I'm going to call this GitHub demo. And then we can add an optional description here. We'll say GitHub Desktop Demo. Then under configuration, the first thing is the visibility. So we can set this as either public, meaning anyone on the internet can see your repository, or you can select private if you want to choose who can access it. I am going to leave this as public. Then next we have the README file. So the README file is a Markdown file. Markdown is a simplified version of HTML, and you can put more info about your repository here. And I'm going to turn this to on. Then we have the git ignore file. This is really for programming projects. If there's specific files that you need in your project, but you don't want to put them publicly on GitHub. And I don't really need one here, so I'm going to leave this as no. And lastly, the license, it dictates how you want to allow or not allow other people to use your code. If you leave it off with no license, it's going to fall under regular copyright. If you do want to let people use your code, usually for like an open source project, you can choose an open source license like MIT or the general public license. And I'm going to leave that as no license. Okay, so now let's click the Create Repository button. And it'll usually take GitHub a few seconds to create this. All right, so now we have created our repository and we are on the repository page. Now there is a lot going on here. I'm just going to show you the most important parts that you'll actually be using. So first up at the top, we have our GitHub username, the repo name. Then below that, we have a row of tabs. We're really mainly going to be just using this code tab here. And this is what is currently loaded. So below the tabs, we have kind of in this main area, again, the repository name, and it tells us that it is public. And then under this, we have this drop down that says main. And this is something called a branch. So a branch is a version of your code and a version of your project files. And you can have multiple versions if you have, let's say, a really big project or you're working on something with multiple developers. But if it's just you working on this and it's not like a really big project, it's fine, I think, to keep everything in the one main version. Now, one of the most important parts of GitHub is something called a commit. This is how GitHub keeps track of your progress. So if you want to save your progress at any point in time while you're doing work, you can create a commit. And this commit acts like a save point for your project at that moment in time. And you can keep creating commits every time you want to save. The commit is basically going to take a snapshot of your project files. So, you can keep making commits as you're working. If you ever make a mistake, you can go back to a previous commit, and it kind of saves your work also in the cloud up on GitHub, which kind of acts like a backup as well. So let's go look at this next panel here. This top bar, it says our username and it says initial commit. So we actually have one commit in our repository already, and it exists because when we initially created the repo, we had set to use a README file. So because of this, GitHub added that README file to our project, and then it automatically created a commit when it made that change in our project files. Now, every commit is going to have some pieces of information. One is the username of whoever made the commit. Right now, that's our username. And then there's a commit message, which is a brief description of what changes were made. And this one says initial commit because this is the one that GitHub made when we created the repository. Then every commit will also have a unique ID and then the date and time of when it was created. Then at the right here, this is going to kind of keep a counter of how many commits total we have in our repository. Right now we just have one commit, but we are going to be adding to that in a little bit. So then below the commit here, and this is going to display the most recent commit, below that we have the files and folders that are in our project. Right now we just have the one README file. Then below that in this panel here, this is going to display the contents of the README file. And right now it just has the name of our repo and then the description that we typed in when we created the repository. All right, so we have our repository up on GitHub, but how do we get it from GitHub down to our own computer so that we can work on our project files? Well, we can do this by doing what's called cloning the repository. Cloning means making a copy of the repository, and we're going to clone it to our computer. So you can also use cloning when you're working on a repository that someone else has made. You can go to GitHub and find that repository and then clone that to your own computer. So to clone, we can go to this green button here and click it. And then we have multiple options for how to clone. What we're going to be using in this video is GitHub Desktop. This is a separate program made by GitHub. And personally, I think it's the most beginner-friendly way to start using GitHub, just because you don't have to use the terminal and type in commands, which I think can be a little bit intimidating for beginners. So to use GitHub Desktop, we do need to download and install it on our computer. So to get GitHub Desktop, we want to go in our browser to desktop.github.com. And then we'll go to the GitHub Desktop page here, and we can click the download button here. And download for your operating system. And then once this download is complete, you're going to want to click to run and install it on your computer. Okay, so once GitHub Desktop finishes installing, it's going to automatically open. Now to set up, the first thing we need to do is to link our GitHub account to GitHub Desktop here, so that GitHub Desktop can access all of our repositories that we have up on GitHub. So to do this, we can go to File, Options, and then under the Accounts tab, we want to sign into github.com. So let's click that, and then click Continue with Browser. And because we're already signed into GitHub, we should see this screen here that says Authorize GitHub Desktop. And just make sure you're signed in as the correct username, which we are, and then click the Continue button. Okay, so now we've been redirected back to GitHub Desktop on our computer. Okay, so again, we want to clone that repository that we made in GitHub to our computer. So we can do that by either clicking this Clone a Repository button. You can also get to the same menu by going to File, Clone Repository. So in this pop-up here to clone, we are first in the github.com tab, and this is going to display all the repositories that you have on your GitHub account. So I do have a lot, so I'm just going to search for GitHub demo, and we can see it here. And if it doesn't show up in the results, maybe because you just made it, you can also click this sync button here to make sure that you have all the latest info from your GitHub account. So once you have the repository, you can select it. And then before we clone, you just want to double check the local path. This is where on your computer, the repository files will be downloaded. So by default on Windows, it's going to Documents GitHub, and then it'll create a new subfolder with the same name as your repository. So that looks good to me. So I'm going to click on Clone. And now we are cloning and downloading the files to our computer. And now we have the GitHub demo repo open as the current repository. And if you have multiple repos on your computer, you can use this. If you click it, it'll open this menu and you can select from all your repositories. I just have the one right now. And then next to that, we have something that says current branch main. So again, this is telling us we're on the main branch. And then next to that, this button says fetch origin. So what does that mean? Well, origin refers to the repository on GitHub in the cloud on the internet that we created. So at this point, we actually have two copies of our repository in existence. We have the origin, the repository we originally made up on GitHub, and that is called the remote repository. Then we have the repository that we just cloned onto our computer, and it exists in our computer files, and this is called the local repository. So basically what's going to happen when you're working on your project, we're going to make some changes locally in our computer files, and with this button, we can sync our changes up to the origin on GitHub. And I know this may sound confusing at this point, but I am going to show you all the steps so that you can see exactly what is going to happen. Also, if you're finding this video helpful so far, I would really appreciate it if you gave the video a like and even leave a quick comment down below, just because it'll really help me out with the YouTube algorithm. So thanks in advance. Next up, we're going to make some code changes on our computer so that we can make commits to GitHub. I'm going to be using VS Code as my code editor. If you don't have VS Code yet, you can download it from code.visualstudio.com and install it on your computer. And if you're not familiar with it, don't worry, you can just follow along with me in this video. But if you do want to learn more about it, I have another video on my channel called VS Code for Beginners that you might find helpful, and I'll link that below. So to open our project in VS Code, we can actually do it right from GitHub Desktop. So on the right side here, it says that we can open our repository in our external editor. I have it set to VS Code. So if you click this button, we're going to open VS Code. And you might notice up here it says restricted mode. And this is showing up because this is the first time opening this folder. So it's just a security measure to make sure that you trust the code here, which we do because we're the ones who created it. So to get out of restricted mode, you can click the Manage button here. And then we want to scroll down and say that we trust this folder. There we go. And then we can close out of this. All right, so we now have the GitHub demo folder open, and in the left sidebar, we can see the files in this folder. Again, right now we just have the README file. So let's make some changes in our code. I'm going to double click the README file to open it. And let's add some more text here just to make a change. We'll say test out GitHub Desktop, and then we'll make another line. This is just a test. And let's save. And let's also create another new file. So I'm going to right click in the sidebar and select new file. And I'm going to make a text file. It doesn't really matter what we make. We're really just making this just so you can see what making a new file will look like in GitHub Desktop. So I'm going to call this test.txt text file. And then in the file itself, we'll write this is also a test, and we'll save that. Okay, so we are back in GitHub Desktop, and now you might notice things look a little bit different. So we have this Changes tab here, and it tells us that we have two changed files. The README file, which existed already, and this has modifications made to it. And you can tell it's modified because it has this yellow square with a dot in it, and that indicates that the file existed in the repository already, but there's new changes from the last commit. And on the right side, we can see more details of the actual code changes. So we added several lines of code to this file, which we can tell by the green highlighted lines with a plus icon. So GitHub will see every file in terms of lines of code, and that's kind of how it keeps track of your changes. So we made, extra line here, and then our 2 lines of text with extra lines between them as well. So that's the modified file. We also have the text file, and you can tell this is a new file because it has a green icon with a plus sign. And if we select that, we can see the actual code in here. Now you might see this alert depending on your editor or your file. It says no new line at end of file. This is basically, it's a programming thing where you need to have a blank line at the bottom of every file. I don't think this will hurt anything, but if you want to get rid of that alert, in the text file in VS Code, just add a new line and save it. And then now in GitHub Desktop, the alert has disappeared. All right, so we've now made changes to our files, and GitHub Desktop has detected those changes. So whenever you are ready to save your progress, you can do so by making a new commit. Now, one thing to note, you don't have to include all of the changes in all the files when you make a commit because, sometimes you might be working for a while and you have a whole lot of files and a whole lot of lines of code, but you might want to just save progress on, one file or a few files. So the good thing is that you can actually select which files and which lines of code you actually want to take the snapshot of when you make your commit. So to do this, you can use these checkboxes. So the checkboxes are to select the files themselves. So let's say we don't want to include the test.txt file. We can just uncheck that. So now it's not going to be included in this next commit. And then let's go to the README file and we don't have to commit every line. Let's say we don't want to include this last line here. We can click this checkbox. And now this line will not be included in the commit either. All right, so now we have chosen which files and which lines of code we want to commit. So we can make our commit down here in the bottom left corner. And the first text box here is where we can write a short commit message. It is going to have an auto-generated message. Right now it just says update readme.md. We can also write a custom message. I'll write a custom one saying add readme text. And then down here, you have the option of adding a longer description if you need, but it's optional, and I'm just going to leave this blank. Okay, so we are ready to make our commit, and we can do that by clicking this button, commit one file to main. Again, main is the main branch. So we will click that button, and now we have created our commit. So if we go to the history tab, we can see that before we have the initial commit, now we have this new commit, add readme text. However, at this point, the commit only exists in our local repository on the computer. It does not exist up on GitHub yet. And you can actually see this. If we go back to GitHub, I'm going to reload the page. And you can see that the most recent commit is still the initial commit. If we click this, we only have the one commit in our repository. So we need to get our commit from our local on GitHub Desktop to GitHub by pushing to origin. So pushing means that you are pushing a change out from where you are. So right now we are pushing from our local up to GitHub. And if there were changes on GitHub that we didn't have on our local, we can do something called pulling or fetching, and that will pull or fetch from GitHub to our local as well. So let's click the push origin button, and you can see we are fetching and refreshing. So it just kind of syncs our local with the remote. So now if we go back to our repository, I'm going to reload. Now the most recent commit says add readme text, and we have two commits in our repository. So if we click that, we can see that we do have this new commit. And because that commit was making a change to our readme file, you can see on our repository page, the readme file also looks different because it has this new line of text that we added. Now, you might be wondering why we have to bother with this two-step process of making a commit locally and then having to manually push it up to GitHub. And if you're just working by yourself, it might not make as much sense to have those two steps, but it is actually very helpful when you're working on, let's say, a large project, especially if you're working with other developers on the same project. Because, if you're working on a really big feature, you might need multiple commits in order to finish whatever you're working on. So if you want to, save your progress with commits, but maybe you're not ready for all of your code to be public on GitHub, you can just wait until you're kind of at a finishing point, and then you can push up all those commits that you made before when you're ready. Also, having that extra step of committing, having things locally, but not pushing to the remote yet, it actually makes it easier to undo things if you make a mistake, and we're going to be getting into that next. All right, so we are back on the Changes tab. So let's say that you make some code changes, but you end up realizing that they were actually a mistake and you just want to kind of get rid of those lines that you added and go back to the way the file was earlier. Well, in GitHub Desktop, let's see what this is going to look like. So in the README file, we have that line, this is just a test, that we added, so it's been changed in our files, but we have not made a commit yet. So let's say we want to get rid of this line because it was a mistake to add that. We can remove that change by right-clicking the file up here and then selecting Discard Changes. So now that line in the README file has not been added, it's been removed. And we can confirm that if we go back to VS Code. In the README file, that last line is not there anymore. So that's how to get rid of changes that have not been committed yet. But what happens if you do commit that change? How do you undo that? So let's test this out by making a commit with this test.txt file. So we're going to make a commit. I'm just going to use the default message here and click commit to main. And we're not going to push, we have just made the commit. So you might notice that at the bottom here, in the changes tab, it says that we committed just now the create test.txt, but there's a nice little undo button. So if we want to undo that change of adding the text file, we can click that. And now the test.txt file has gone back to being not committed. So these work if you realize that you want to undo things before pushing to GitHub, but even if you do commit and push, there's still a way to undo the work that you did. So back in the Changes tab, let's commit that change again. And this time we are going to push to origin. So now we've created our commit. It's in the history here, and we've also pushed to the origin. So if we go to our repository page and reload, we have the create test.txt file, and it is the third commit. But we want to undo this change that we committed and also push to GitHub. So if we want to undo it, we can right-click the commit and revert changes in commit. So let's select that. So this is a little bit different. So we're not removing the commit that we made like before, but what GitHub Desktop did was it created another commit automatically, and this is doing the reverse of what the commit that we reverted did. So the original commit added the test.txt file. This new commit deleted the test.txt file. So it created a new commit saying revert create test.txt, which is the commit message from that commit previously. So you might be wondering, why did we have to create a whole new commit to undo the code changes from that previous commit? Well, this is because we did push this previous commit up to GitHub. So this makes the commit public, and it can cause a lot of problems because there's other people potentially working on the GitHub project. So if someone else was working on it and they synced their repo with GitHub and they got this commit into their own local repository, but then we deleted that commit, it's going to mess things up for everyone because people are going to have different versions of the history, which is not a good thing. So this is why the best way to quote unquote undo a commit that you have pushed publicly is to create another commit on top of that just reverses the work that you did. So you're not deleting any public things, which is bad. You're just adding and reverting the work that you did. All right, so when you revert a commit, the last thing you want to do is you want to push this to the origin. So now we can see on our repo, we have this commit reverting what we did before. All right, so this is a pretty basic workflow of making changes, committing, and then pushing to GitHub. If you do want to learn more about more advanced things in GitHub, for example, branching and merging, you might like this full tutorial that I have on my channel, and I do have it linked down below as well. So I hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.